Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Mary S. Barton entitled Counterterrorism Between the Wars and International History, 1919 to 1937, published last year by Oxford University Press. And joining us this afternoon as discussants are Laura Robson of the Penn State University and Catherine Unterman of Texas A&M. I'm Eric Arnesen from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Ostermann of the Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center and, well, since the pandemic, here in the virtual realm. Behind the scenes, we thank two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And we'd like to thank our institutional supporters as well as a number of anonymous donors. As we say every week, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, not the chat function. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn over the session now to Christian Ostermann, who will be moderating this afternoon. Christian, welcome.
Thanks so much, Eric. Great to be back in DC to co-chair this session from here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers. I'll start with our featured speaker, Dr. Barton, and then later on, after she has given her presentation, we'll introduce our two distinguished commentators. Mary S. Barton is an analyst with the US government. She received her Ph.D. from the University of Virginia in 2016. She completed postdoctoral fellowships at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, SAIS, and at Dartmouth College. And she previously served as historian and wargaming analyst supporting the Office of the Secretary of Defense. She was a former Title VIII short-term scholar with the Ken Institute here at the Wilson Center. So welcome back, Mary. We love our alumni. Today she will talk about her 2020 book, Counterterrorism Between the Wars, International History, 1919 to 1937. Mary, the Zoom room is all yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Well, of course, I want to thank Christian and Eric for the kind introduction and the opportunity to present today. And I want to thank Kate and Laura for their time and I'm looking forward to the discussion, as well as thanking Rachel and Peter for their help with organizing the talk. So I have some slides that I would like to get it started with. I'm going to stop my video for this part. So I wanted to start the talk today with how I start the book, and that's with the attempted assassination of French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And of importance to my story is that the would-be assassin, a French anarchist, used a Browning pistol purchased from a demobilized French soldier returning from the trenches of World War I. The assassination fails, Clemenceau recovers, and this episode is largely forgotten in historical memory, as is much of the effort by governments to counter terrorism during the 1920s and 1930s, a period later referred to as the interwar years. But as I try to demonstrate in my book, governments and the League of Nations sponsored a number of initiatives to regulate the arms trade because of its direct correlation with terrorism, a relationship most often cited by the British in their policy documents and intelligence reports. So the book is organized around three main conferences, starting with the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which includes this arms trafficking convention, really at the behest of the British to prevent the weapons of the First World War from reaching anti-colonial nationalists who might be challenging imperial rule. It also includes provisions in the peace treaties with what are known as ex-enemy states, the defeated nations of World War I, including Germany, Hungary, Austria, and Bulgaria, that include for their disarmament and the creation of the first international weapons inspectors, who were to make sure that arms were being destroyed. But these, according to British and US intelligence reporting, this convention is not sort of enforced or and it's never ratified. And so arms trafficking continues to be an issue. So in 1925, the League of Nations convenes another conference at Geneva, in which many of the major powers are there again, except for Germany and the Soviet Union. And they conclude another treaty to prevent arms trafficking, which again fails a ratification. Finally, after the double assassination of the King of Yugoslavia and the French foreign minister by a Croatian terrorist organization in France of 1934, the League of Nations takes up terrorism and it defines it as in law, in treaty law, as acts against the state. And the colonial government of India also includes a provision in this treaty to try and prevent arms smuggling. So, sorry, to go back, I organized the book in this way because it allows me to look at sort of, to bring all the major players, or many of the major players into the room, in this case, Paris and Geneva, and highlight a couple of things. So one, who's not there, who's not participating, what their major positions are, how they define and understand terrorism and gun running, and the relationship between those. And lastly, how these positions change over time. So looking at the story in this way, there are four central themes to the book. The ways in which terrorism is changing after the First World War, the establishment of the infrastructure of modern intelligence, and the concept of peacetime, which is tied to intelligence, because it's a very sort of war by other means during this time period, including active intelligence measures. In signals intelligence, as the British were able to decipher Soviet codes from 1920 to 1927, and human intelligence and the extraordinary recruitments of the Soviets, and most famously Cambridge 5, but of course other high-level officials and many Western governments, and also disinformation campaigns with governments planting stories in newspapers to further their position, as well as assassinations and international terrorism. And finally, and this is what underpins sort of the innovative initiatives involving counterterrorism for the interwar years, is even in the 1920s, the great powers, and especially those powers that had fought the First World War together, were already differing in how they understood terrorism as threatening their national security and imperial priorities. So just to dive a little bit deeper to two areas, interwar terrorism. So before the First World War, terrorism tended to be connected with anarchist assassinations, at least among Western governments and newspapers. And this has a lasting legacy, as many U.S. State Department officials and British intelligence still tend to see terrorism as connected to left-wing groups, including, and in particular, the Soviet Comintern. And it also tends to be understood as a tactic of assassination of high-ranking officials. But terrorism is also changing because it's associated with other groups of various political persuasions, and especially with right-wing and nationalist groups by the 1930s. And in this book, I use it most often when it was used at the time by governments describing the Comintern, by the British to describe revolutionary nationalists in India, and in the Balkans used to describe Croatian and Macedonian sort of nationalist groups, ultra-nationalist groups. There's also the emergence of state-sponsored terrorism, and this differs from anarchist terrorism. And in particular, so you have the Soviets and the Comintern, but also on the European continent, you have what are known as the revisionist powers, so the defeated powers along with Italy, who oppose the Versailles system and the territorial agreements of the First World War. And in contrast to the revisionist powers, you have the status quo powers that would like to maintain the Versailles system. And those are led sort of by the victorious powers, so France with a little entente, which is Yugoslavia, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. And adding to sort of this combustion are the ideologies and sort of violence of the period with Soviet communism, fascism, and ultranationalism based on exclusive categories of ethnicity and race. So how do governments respond? Well, it's an active period in terms of what we would now call counterterrorism laws and practices. So as mentioned before, and in the book, I really focus on British counterterrorism in India and sort of identify three practices. One is arms control, passport restrictions, and domestic anti-terrorism legislation, which is based, there are older laws, but it's based primarily on sort of the emergency powers of the First World War, and those carry on into peacetime. But then there are also these larger initiatives. So as I mentioned before, the arms trafficking conventions, the peace treaties. The League of Nations is arbitrating and receiving cases about arms trafficking, normally from the revisionist and status quo powers, trying to internationalize their causes and receive attention for them, which quite to the annoyance of France and Britain, which don't believe the League should be used in that way. Then the League, of course, addresses the issue of counterterrorism in the mid-30s. Intelligence agencies after the First World War, particularly for the British, but for other countries as well, become more professionalized. Even though they become smaller, they're more professionalized and permanent. Then there are a number of legal laws and law enforcement. So while the military and martial law is used at times, of course, in India and Ireland and Palestine and Syria, terrorism is generally understood to be a policing and intelligence issue that's best to be addressed using domestic legislation, border controls, and international law. So there are two, as I sort of have taken some time away from the book, there are two issues that really stand out to me, and that's interwar intelligence. So I really focus on British intelligence, but I also look at the origins of what we would say is a special intelligence relationship between the Americans and the British. And then here I'm looking at Boylston Beale, an unknown State Department special agent who is in London. And it's really and he has contacts in Special Branch who later moved to MI5. And what's important here is that these relationships and the information sharing, there are no formal agreements. They're all personal. And so in some ways, the State Department and their British colleagues are closer than even the British intelligence are among themselves with MI5 and Special Branch and MI6 information sharing, or the State Department and the FBI. That there's more willingness to share with these colleagues who have a similar class and sort of educational background. And there's the common threat, an enemy in the Soviet Union, which is an impetus for a lot of the information sharing. The other issue is diplomacy, and intelligence plays a role here, because one of the things I found interesting and a hard question to answer is that the British knew through intelligence reporting, and the US State Department knew through its gathering of intelligence that arms continued to circulate throughout the world in the 20s, and that they were being used by various groups to carry out violence. And in particular, the British knew that in Hamburg was a leading site for arms to be trafficked into British India, where they were being used against colonial administrators. But they make the decision to not prioritize that issue and to withdraw and to the international weapons inspectors from Germany, that they would prefer to have stability on the continent and revert sort of to the empire versus addressing these issues. So for me, there's the question then of, always the lasting question for intelligence of when it leads to political action. Then the second is the long legacy of the First World War, and you can see that influencing so much in diplomacy for this period. The decision, so the League of Nations, when it takes up the terrorism cases after the assassination of the King of Yugoslavia and the French Foreign Minister, Anthony Eden is leading the way, and he is doing so because of the sense that Britain did not act quick enough after the assassinations in Sarajevo, and that they needed to exert a restraining hand. And so there's always, there were so many references to how the assassinations at Marseille in France were similar to those of Sarajevo, but this was different. Of course, later, looking at this, historians dismissed the League initiatives as being political theater and appeasement to Italy. But at the time, it was considered, their reference point was the First World War. And then last is the role of the League of Nations and kind of interagencies or intergovernment agencies in general. One of the points I make in the book is the difference of opinions about terrorism between London and Delhi. And this is for the duration of the interwar period, and particularly in the 1930s. And so because India has separate membership in the League, they're able to sign, and they're the only the colonial government, the only government to actually ratify the 1937 terrorism treaty. And it does so because it's been combating revolutionary nationalism for 3 decades, and because they believe it's a way to coerce European governments to prevent arms trafficking. At the same time, the League is also allowing for smaller states to be more engaged and have an active voice in international affairs. But of course, by the end of the 30s, many of the major decisions are being made outside of the League, and that influences later the Security Council. So I will stop there.
We have the privilege of having 2 wonderful commentators, 2 wonderful scholars serving as commentators here this afternoon. We'll start. Our first commentator will be Dr. Christian Ostermann. She is Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University. She holds a Ph.D. from Yale University and a Master's in Legal Studies from Stanford Law School. She is the author of Uncle Sam's Policeman, The Pursuit of Fugitives Across Borders, published by Harvard in 2015. Her next book, The Colonial Constitution, Law and Empire in the U.S. Territories, focus on the Insular Cases, a series of Supreme Court decisions about the legal status of unincorporated territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and American Samoa. She's received fellowships from the ACLS and the NEH. It's wonderful to welcome you to the Washington History Seminar, Professor Ostermann. Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I actually saw this book evolve through the years in Mary's conference presentations, and so now I'm thrilled to have the finished product in print. I want to reflect on a few things that really struck me in this book. Maybe not necessarily the things that Mary wanted me to be struck by, but some things that really got me thinking in the book. And then I'll pose some questions for Mary throughout. For those of you in the audience who haven't read it yet, let me vouch that this book is very accessible to non-experts in European politics, like myself. It's clearly written, it provides lots of explanatory context, and it's really meticulously researched in the archives of multiple nations. The interwar period is one of these fascinating eras that historians sometimes treat as mere prelude to World War II, sort of with this laser focus on the rise of fascism and militarism in Germany, Italy, and Japan. But counterterrorism between the wars does something different. It considers the interwar period on its own terms. So by that, I mean that it helps us understand what the great power governments at the time, not knowing what would come next, considered their greatest threats. Britain, and to a lesser extent, the United States and France, feared political instability and even another war, but they had various ideas about where future violence might come from, including anti-colonial nationalist movements, European revisionists who were challenging the Versailles system, and Soviet-influenced communists. One thing that I really appreciated about this book was how Mary brought together these various challenges to the great powers during the interwar period to show how the strategies and initiatives derived in one context or in response to one problem could also carry over to other areas as well. So in terms of historiographical interventions, counterterrorism between the wars challenges the assumption that the British and American national security states didn't emerge until after World War II, right? Which is what we often assume. In fact, a good part of the foundation of these security states was established during the interwar period, from the collecting and sharing of intelligence information to the creation of new governmental agencies, to new legal regimes with emergency or exceptional powers for fighting terrorism. And a lot of this nascent national security state actually involved the extension of war powers that had been granted or asserted during World War I. So in this sense, Mary is not only challenging the idea of peacetime due to the violence of the interwar years, but also because supposedly temporary wartime practices and powers continued into the 1920s and 30s, right? It continued into this supposed peacetime. So my first question for Mary is about the implications of this periodization. How do we understand the British and American national security states of the 20th century differently when we recognize their pre-Cold War origins? Or to rephrase the question, what do we miss or misunderstand about these national security states when we study their origins only in a Cold War context? I was struck again and again in this book by how much Britain's national security state emerged and expanded in order to secure its empire. Right? This was a time when Britain's empire was at its height, just after World War I, when it controlled roughly a quarter of the world's population and landmass. Rather than weakening imperial governance, attacks on the colonial system, at least in the short term, resulted in strengthened state power. For example, Mary writes about anti-terrorism laws enacted in 1925 in response to anti-colonial violence in Bengal, which empowered the colonial government to arrest alleged terrorists without warrants or trials. So when reading Counterterrorism Between the Wars, I actually found myself thinking about two other recently published books, Caroline Elkin's Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire, which I admit I haven't read yet. It came out less than a month ago, but there was a great review of it in the New Yorker. And also Moon Ho Jung's Menace to Empire, Anti-Colonial Solidarities and the Trans-Pacific Origins of the US Security State, which addresses anti-colonial movements in the US empire, in the Pacific, in the years before World War II. So these books both came out in 2022. Obviously, they weren't, Mary couldn't cite them, but both Elkins and Junk's books are great complements to Counterterrorism Between the Wars. One notable difference is that those books are openly critical of the tremendous amount of violence and repression involved in putting down anti-colonial nationalist revolts. Now, Counterterrorism Between the Wars certainly doesn't ignore the violence involved, for example, in British counterterrorism efforts in India. But Counterterrorism Between the Wars has a far more measured tone when discussing the tactics used to maintain empire. And well, as I read it, it sounded like the book was kind of withholding judgment, neither condemning nor defending counter-terrorist policies. So I'd like to ask Mary about her decision to take this tone and her judgment about these policies, whether in terms of their morality or their effectiveness. As I was reading, I kept thinking about which acts were defined as illicit, subversive, or terroristic, and therefore to be combated with counterterrorism measures, versus which weren't. As Mary points out, British officials considered Irish nationalists to be terrorists, while Americans saw them as freedom fighters. Some gun sellers were deemed to be engaged in illicit arms trafficking, but American gun manufacturers were carrying out international commerce. Equally unsurprising, the US government claimed that domestic terrorism wasn't a problem after 1920. But of course, during the 1920s, non-state actors in the US carried out plenty of political violence with the goal of terrorizing a population, only it was called lynching, not terrorism. And so it lies outside the scope of this book. So the fact that the definition of terrorism depends on the interests of those in power is a fairly obvious point, but it bears repeating, if only to remind us that counterterrorism is not only about stopping violence, but also about maintaining power and control. So on that note, my final observation when reading the book was about how British and American counterterrorism efforts were concerned not just with stopping violence, but also with suppressing revolutionary or radical speech. I'm less familiar with speech law in Britain, but the interwar years were incredibly important in the United States for First Amendment cases. And anarchists and communists were often at the forefront of these cases. Some of the interwar court decisions extended speech protections to political radicals, while others allowed their speech to be criminalized as a clear and present danger. Now, both Britain and the United States were liberal democracies ostensibly committed to ideas like the rule of law, due process, and individual rights. Moreover, they openly presented themselves as bearing the, quote, white man's burden of tutoring the rest of the world in those principles. So my last question for Mary is, to what extent did the status, or at least the self-image of Britain and the United States as liberal democracies affect their counterterrorism strategies? And I was also curious about whether their judiciaries or public opinion restrained or guided these government actions. So I think I've posed 3 questions for Mary, one about periodization and how the reperiodization of the the rise of the national security state to the pre-Cold War era changes our understanding of it. The second question about the tone of the book and your judgments about counterterrorism policies. And finally, to what extent did the status of Britain and the United States as liberal democracies affect their counterterrorism efforts? Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'd like to give Mary a chance to respond to those questions directly right now, before I then I'll have Laura join the conversation. Mary, Would you like to respond to the three questions?
Thank you so much, Kate. It's always wonderful to see you, and you've been a mentor over the years, so I'm grateful again for your consideration of my book and for your questions and for your kind words. So for your first question, it's a little tricky, I think, in terms of the periodization and what that means. I think it's clear as in intelligence that these relationships existed prior to the Second World War and the Cold War, that it didn't require, at least in terms of what we look through the origins of Five Eyes or the US-UK special relationship, it did not require sort of formal agreements around signals intelligence to foster that type of relationship. I think what mattered quite a bit was first, as with the Second World War, the experience of working together during the war, and then second, a shared conception of what the enemy was. And in both, they tended to be the Soviet Union. Whereas in the 20s and 30s, it was not so much how we might think of it after World War I, that the Soviet Union, as Mel Leffler would say, and I'm paraphrasing, hopefully I don't get this wrong, sort of getting all of the land and resources of the Eurasia landmass and using those against the US, but rather, and sort of Western governments, but rather in this case, the Comintern and the interference in liberal democracies. And the fact, and in both there was a fear and a playing out of these Cold War ideological competitions in Europe and also in the colonies. So I think in some ways there are continuations. Actually, a lot of some of the trends that we see more how we think about the national security state, it just perhaps escalates and becomes more permanent in some sense. And the US is playing a much bigger role after the Second World War. I would see it more in that way. In terms of tone, I think to me it's important that the historian, as a historian, I have always sought to be objective in my analysis. And of course, knowing that we always have our own biases, we have the biases of the archives and the omissions of the archives as well. So, but I believe that it is an important objective to put this story together in the best way that you can in terms of what the evidence is. And I often think that it's overwhelming, sort of in allowing for people to come to their own position and moral standing on something. I do think in this case, when you look at the story that I say particularly, so in the British case in India, I write a lot about the camp system and the detention systems. And it was in no way an effective counterterrorism strategy to simply arrest and detain those accused of terrorist crimes even before they had committed crime. And the British were challenged. They were challenged in India and they were challenged at home. And in some ways, I think it's been underestimated the role that the revolutionary nationalists played in sort of upending the British Empire, because it became clear, and this is your self-conception question, that in order to maintain sort of a racial hierarchical control in India, which, they had just waged a war against that during the Second World War, that they would continue to have to arrest and detain people in these massive camps, which were then often recruited by the communists, which was an undermining. So I think if you look at the story, my position on things to me is clear. But again, I think it is important to be objective, because I think you can be discredited as a historian in some ways if you aren't. I also think I've influenced a lot in sort of the way the literature has changed in looking at communism. Certainly during the Red Scare, because of the excesses of the Red Scare, there was a shift, in the literature and a change in interpretation of literature to not see sort of communist groups as being influenced or perhaps under the direction of Moscow. And it was really with the opening in the 1990s of the archives that case became more clear that Moscow had played quite a role, the Comintern had played quite a role. Was it as big a threat, as we might say, looking back now? It probably not. But because that literature was often, and terrorism in general is often, can be imbued with people's political stance in the contemporary time period, I think that that can serve to, in the long run, call into question some of their historical assessments. So it was important to me to be objective in this book. And the other thing about it's actually quite a big part of the story is looking at how the British and the Americans have their own conceptions of themselves as in terms of aiding, being a place of asylum, and also the way that they think about counterterrorism. They're both, without any sort of self-introspection, policymakers willing to look at their own practices as perhaps as being similar to authoritarian regimes. So the US is very clear in the 30s that it doesn't have a problem with terrorism, despite, and in that way, what they're referring to is to European politics. I never saw in the records references to the Ku Klux Klan or to Jim Crow South or to anything, any sort of like acknowledgement of terrorism in the United States. And certainly, from what I can tell, what I've read from others, the term was not used then. And part of what I wanted to show with this book is the intellectual history of terrorism, that because it was associated with anarchist policy elites, often in the US and the UK, associated it with left-wing groups. And there's a reason for that. In the UK, quite remarkably, in the late 1930s, when there are these terrorism cases, its legal advisors in the Home Office are very explicit that they're not like the authoritarian fascist regimes, and that there is no need for terrorism laws in the UK. There is no talk about movements that are challenged in India and elsewhere that are challenging British rule, that they might see British authority as being the same as their government. And the British Home Office also wants to reserve the right to help with rebellions or overthrow governments when they need to, versus in contrast, strong contrast to the colonial government in Delhi, which wants to preserve the sanctity of the state, including through sort of drastic laws and legislation. I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thank you. Before I introduce our next speaker, let me remind all of you in the audience that we would very much like to hear from you, your questions, your comments on the presentations, on the book. You have 3 ways to join us. Our preferred way is to bring you in the conversation directly by getting into the queue through the raise hand function. You will be queued, and then I will call on you, and you will you can pose your question directly to the speakers. The alternative is you use the Q&A function in the Zoom functionality and post your comment or question, and I will put it to our speakers. And finally, if you're watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to email Rachel Wheatley, who will pass on the question to us. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome back Professor Laura Robson to the Washington History Seminar. Laura is the Oliver McCurtney Professor of History at Penn State University and currently one of ours at the Wilson Center, a fellow. And we've had the pleasure to have her in residence for the most part for the past year. She's received her Ph.D. from Yale University and is the author and editor of several books. Just to mention a couple: States of Separation, Transfer, Partition, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, University of California Press, 2017, and the edited volume Partitions, A Transnational History of 20th Century territorial separatism. Her latest book, The Politics of Mass Violence in the Middle East, was published by Oxford in the fall of 2020, and we were very pleased to discuss it at the Washington History Seminar last spring, I think it was. So welcome back, Laura. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Christian, for that kind introduction. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. This is a really fascinating book that Mary has put together here with a lot of incredibly valuable archival details that I think really do help us to understand the interwar period, speaking generally, and also what we sometimes refer to as the Paris Order, right, following historians like Eric White's. And it's a concise book and it's a specific book. And I think that the way that Mary has thought through this thread of terrorism and counterterrorism brings together different political frames, including the British Empire, the rising American Empire, and the frame of communism and anti-communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in ways that are really generative. These are not frames that we always see being discussed together and in conversation with one another. So it's a really useful addition to the literature on the interwar period, which has really burgeoned over the last couple of decades. And I'm really delighted to be able to take part in this conversation about it. So I will do essentially what Kate did, which is to make a couple of comments about what I see as the most important takeaways of this volume. And then I'll pose a few questions and maybe a couple of challenges to Mary so that we can get our discussion started. First of all, Mary opens this book by detailing the proliferation of arms across Europe and across the globe after the First World War. And I want to begin by saying that I am firmly of the opinion that this sort of material history of arms should be a feature of every volume that deals with political violence across the globe in any period, and it's generally not. So I want to, first of all, just say kudos for this incredibly detailed and specific and valuable contribution in terms of this information, this kind of material history of weaponry that really, will be very useful to a lot of different historians working in a number of different fields. And connected to this, I think one of the really compelling takeaways from her analysis is that she makes the point repeatedly that this proliferation of weapons, of arms, is crucial to understanding the violence of this period. And this idea of the kind of materiality and availability of weaponry as central to the exercise of political violence, I think is an underrated and often overlooked and also really important and correct point to be making. So this is an important corrective to our understanding of the interwar period as it stands. Second, Mary makes the argument that there are significant connections between developing regimes of arms control and regimes of migration control, alongside what she calls domestic anti-terror legislation, which is essentially, as we've already discussed a little bit, legislation that essentially denies criminal subjects their civil rights. The connections between these three things, and particularly between arms control and migration control, seem extremely important to me as someone who's interested in the emergence of kind of documentary regimes of nationality and border control during this period. I think that it suggests, and I'll be interested to hear if Mary agrees with me here, but it suggests the fundamental rationale for the development of this modern passport and mobility surveillance regime is one of modern imperial control. So it's extremely useful to tie these two schemes of arms control and migration control, as Mary does, to draconian forms of military rule and the emergence of what I think we would now call carceral states, characterized by huge numbers of internment camps and prisons for anti-colonial activists in places like Bengal. In other words, what she's describing here is that we are seeing the violent territorialization of the late colonial state, with counterterrorism as both an important practical mode of operation and also as a crucial political. She goes on to make the point that this is almost equally true in the American context, where control of weaponry went alongside deportation as a tactic for anti-communist action in domestic arenas. So again, we're seeing the use of a frame of counterterrorism to construct a restrictive and at moments punitive political landscape. So this book suggests in really interesting ways how we might think about how arms control, migration control, and intelligence are kind of the three legs of the same post-war imperial frame that reaches across the Atlantic. They are ways of exerting both continuing and new forms of imperial control that are designed for the specificities of this new era. And finally, I think that one of the crucial things that she's exploring here is the way that state support for these terrorist and revanchist and irredentist movements within Europe, particularly vis-a-vis the ongoing territorial battles over the Versailles agreements in Central and Eastern Europe, added to the chaos and uncertainties of the interwar period, and arguably did, in fact, eventually help push Europe into another war. Okay, so I have a few questions and maybe even challenges about that I want to pose to Mary as a way of expanding the conversation that she started here with this really important and interesting. First of all, I want to start with this question of arms control. Mary's account in this book suggests that very few, maybe none, of the measures that are discussed in these treaties and agreements and international conversations about arms control are directed at the great powers themselves. In other words, what I want to ask her is, what are the ramifications, both in this period and going forward, of understanding this as a question of arms trafficking, as the control of arms trafficking, rather than the control of arms possession and manufacture. And tying this to intelligence and the gathering of information, I think, presents the same kind of problem, that this is being presented and that people discussing it understand it as a problem, not that there are arms floating around, right? But when those arms go to the wrong people. And that is particularly when they are held outside the apparatus of formal European empire. That certainly seems to be the League's approach, and it perhaps goes some way to explain the fundamental inefficacy of this regime, as it does not really address the source of these weapons and doesn't seek to control those who have the most of them, which I think is actually unsurprising, since the League is, in fact, I would argue, an engine and an extension of those same powers, which is a point I'd like to come back to at the end. Secondly, and admittedly, this is sort of diving into a genuine minefield, and will echo some of the things that Kate said. I wonder if we need to think a bit more carefully about the question of what constitutes both terrorism and counterterrorism. So much of the counterterrorism that Mary is discussing here is happening in imperial contexts where there are indeed terrorists operating in the name of nationalism and anti-colonialism, but where the state itself is engaged in long-term campaigns of terror directed at civilians to a considerable degree, often, in fact, to a much greater degree than its purported terrorist targets. So my question is this frame of counterterrorism, those words, the right rhetorical and discursive frame for talking about a colonial campaign of often brutal military occupation and an anti-colonial resistance that is perpetually drawing on limited political recognition and marginal military capacity? So in other words, this is actually not just a question about tone, but a question about accuracy, right? To what extent does using a word like counterterrorism slightly misleadingly suggest that these acts are a response to anti-colonial violence rather than an ongoing further expansion of powers within a long-standing regime of colonial brutality? And echoing some of Kate's points, I think one of the things I'm trying to get at as well with this question is, are there ways to talk about these developments while also, I think, acknowledging the fundamental political illegitimacy of so many of these intelligence and counterterrorism operations in the context of imperial occupations? This is something I'll just add that scholars have really begun to do very effectively for Palestine, along the lines of what Priya Satya did for the Arabian context some years ago. And along a related but slightly different track, it also seems to me that this category of state-sponsored terrorism is a tricky one. What counts here as state-sponsored terrorism, and how is it different from other kinds of violence that are also endemic to empire? For instance, something like states supporting settler violence in places like Palestine or Algeria. How is it possible to draw meaningful lines around such a category? And how might it relate to much later instances of similar tactics undertaken by different imperial states? For instance, to draw in more recent history, one might think of the events surrounding the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s. So I wonder if this is perhaps an analytical category that could also bear a slightly closer examination. Finally, I want to close by raising a few questions about modern internationalism, which is a major focus of Mary's work here, and the League of Nations. And specifically, I want to ask her, to what extent does this frame of terrorism allow the League to maintain and extend its own capacities, especially vis-a-vis colonized spaces? In other words, could you suggest that the use of the term terrorism in places like Palestine and Syria serves to legitimize the ongoing European military occupation and the League's mandatory system more generally? And maybe to be a little bit provocative, is perhaps that this kind of terrorism, this kind of anti-colonial violence, not entirely regretted by these League observers? I wonder if you could argue that the League, in fact, is not entirely sorry to see ongoing anti-colonial violence, because they see it as something that provides a kind of ongoing mode of extension for what was supposed to be a temporary system of European colonial rule over the so-called mandate states. And finally, I want to close with a general reflection about this internationalist frame that Mary described in such useful detail. This book understands the League in terms that we've heard in many, many other contexts, in economic contexts, in the context of the history of human rights, minority rights, all sorts of things. And that is, as an institution that basically means well, but doesn't have the capacity to realize its visions. But I think the evidence that is presented in Mary's book, which, like much other evidence about this emerging internationalism, has left me wondering if, in general, we tend to be a bit too generous about the League's intentions versus its capacities. Some of the details that Mary so carefully and usefully outlines here, I think, should perhaps remind us that when we're talking about interwar internationalism in the form of the League, we would perhaps do well to remember its central role as an advocate and legitimizer of extremely brutal forms of colonial occupation and colonial violence, even as it publicly touted its own role as a global peacemaker. So I'll close with those questions, and thank you so much to all of you, and especially to Mary, for producing such a thought-provoking work that sparks questions and thoughts in so many different directions.
Thanks so much, Laura. Mary, over to you. I think it was 5 questions, if I counted correctly. So have at it.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura, for your time and your consideration and your thoughtful questions. I might group some of the questions together. So on the first one on arms control, all of these issues were quite debated, and whether we're talking about arms trafficking, whether we're talking about trying to limit or control the manufacture of weapons, and in the League of Nations, it's a huge initiative to publish net imports and net exports of weapons. That's a lot of, that's part of why I say it's the beginning of what we understand to be open source intelligence. Part of it is connected to this time period, the belief that international law and publicity will serve enough, will be a motive enough to change state behaviors. So everyone will play by the rules of the game if it's publicized. what I think this book shows, and of course on many other scholars have showed, is that, of course, is not the case. So the arms trafficking treaties that I look at, 1919, 1925, they have no enforcement mechanisms. And so there's no way, if a state violates them, is anyone punished. And that's intentional, because they would have never passed national legislatures without them. And even then, they weren't ratified. But it was also, again, this idea at the time, after the carnage of the First World War, that publicity alone, that you could name and shame. And that has continued, actually, in some of the modern period. But at the 1925 conference, it shifts from trafficking because the British realized they weren't really effective in getting other countries, and including what's clear with their own Ministry of Munitions, which wants to sell weapons to the US to help pay off debts, that they're not even sort of able to regulate internally. And so when trafficking, which is hard, any type of trafficking, and that's a huge issue for the League, all sorts of trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, the difficulties with that, it raises questions about the manufacturers of weapons. And at this time, it's really only a handful of states. So at the 1925 conference, it's only the Soviet Union that's not in attendance. It's the only non-major manufacturer of weapons not there. But a lot of countries who manufacture weapons don't want to abide by the treaty because of the financial cost and the belief that if they do limit how many arms they manufacture, another country will take that opportunity to basically, for economic reasons. And so they tend to, which I show in the book about Belgium, they label these as what we call dual use technologies, saying that these weapons are for peace and not for war. And then the net importers, governments do not want to publicize how many weapons that they are buying because of the security threat that imposes. And so you actually have the case in 1825, the border states to the Soviet Union are given leeway to not actually publish how much they import, because it would be considered to be an intelligence disaster if the Soviet Union knew, well, this country Estonia is only importing this many guns, so we're going to invade, or that was the fear at the time. So all of these issues are big ones. They're debated. The League debates it in many ways. Legal jurists at the time debate it in many ways. On the second question, counterterrorism is something I've thought a lot about. And it's important to understand what these terms mean and the way that these terms have changed over time. So what's, I think, unique and maybe underappreciated is that terrorism, when it first came about as a term, most scholars attribute this to Russia in 19th century, sort of Russian revolutionaries. It was not pejorative. It's not how we understand it today. It was actually a badge of honor, and it was to distinguish sort of regular murder, this as being political murder that was justified against the state. So many organizations and groups called themselves terrorists at the time, but it's during the 1920s and the 1930s when it's getting codified in laws, and in particular in colonial contexts, that it begins to take on this derogatory term, and different groups start to oppose using the terms to describe themselves. So the political scientist, David Robinson, he's written these 4 waves of international terrorism. He says that it's actually a Zionist group is the last one to use the term terrorism to describe themselves, and their sort of rival, by mention, he describes his group as freedom fighters against the terrorist state, and sort of going, and that's the term that is embraced after the Second World War, that freedom fighters, and a greater understanding that the state, in particular the colonial state during the revolutionary nationalist movements, is in itself conducting terror against the population. It's also important to understand that terrorism at this time was really specific to targeting government officials and symbols of the state. it changes later, I mean, in the 1970s onward to be where you always have cases where civilians are targeted or civilians are considered to be collateral. But it does change in terms of the targeting, that it becomes used against civilian targets than government targets, but that's later in the 20th century. In terms of counterterrorism, I think it's important to, again, understand the origins of why governments, what those practices may be. So whether it's law or intelligence sharing, I wanted to show how it came about from how different governments understood it at the time. And so that was my objective there. And then in terms, for your last ones about the League of Nations, about state-sponsored terrorism, I actually think it's quite interesting. In terms of Europe, about the revisionists and the status quo powers, that the way that they are challenging and trying to perpetuate, the Paris Order or the Versailles system, and that sponsoring foreign groups who are looking to destabilize governments that they consider their enemy, that's one way to do it, that's a foreign policy tool. It's an important realization, I think, about the interwar period, that the legacy of the territorial settlements of World War I continues to influence throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and to justify interfering in foreign governments to help topple them or to destabilize them for regional reasons, for irredenticist reasons. And then finally on the League, one thing Susan Peterson's book, she mentions this, and I also mention it in the book, is when the French start to come on board for an arms trafficking treaty, one of the things I say is that France is, and of course others, France is mostly focused on rearming Germany and sees Germany as the main threat, but they do become more involved in their empire, which has grown, of course, after World War I. And it's the bombing, and after bombing Damascus in 1825, there are Syrian nationalists who come to the League of Nations looking to redress this issue, and also the fact that France is arming certain groups against other groups is in violation of the treaty. And what Susan Peterson says is that the League's decision to side with France and Britain, which supports France, is an undermining experience and helps to delegitimize the League in the eyes of a lot of most colonial nationalists. And I also show in my book, in Europe, this is also the case, and also tends to be a reason why some revolutionary nationalists said that they turned to violence. So I found letters written by Macedonian groups in the US and Canada to the League protesting Serbian violence towards them and the Serbian police state, and saying that because the League and the great powers had not intervened or punished Serbia to change, to give Croatia or to give Macedonia to be a free state, then these organizations had turned to violence to achieve those means on their own. So I think it's I think in this case, I wanted to use the League to show some of the cases, because it documents the arms trafficking and terrorism cases that are being held there, and the way that the great powers influence those cases. And for the peace treaties, again, the fact that these were very well-known violations, but no action was taken to address the issues in the 1920s and the escalating violence of the 1930s.
Thank you. Laura and Kate, any sort of immediate responses to Mary's responses? No? Okay, then thank you, Mary. I think those were helpful responses, and I'd like to broaden our conversation to first bring in John Pielemeyer. And while he is unmuting, just to remind everyone, please join the conversation by using the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality, or posting your question or comment.
Sorry, this is left over from a previous meeting. I'm sorry, I don't have a question, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll go on to Stephen Shore.
I have two brief, can you hear me?
Yes.
Two brief but unrelated questions. The first is, of course, World War I began with the terrorist act of the assassination of the Archduke at Sarajevo. Were people explicitly aware of this in what they planned for counterterrorism in the interwar period? And the second is, of course, during this period, what could be considered the last and most atrocious colonial war, the Sino-Japanese War, was taking place, first with the seizure of Manchuria in 1931, and then the war itself, crossing the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937. Japan has gone completely unmentioned during this discussion. So these are my two questions.
Thank you. Mary?
Thanks for your questions. So in terms of the assassinations at Sarajevo, they influenced quite a bit, as I mentioned, at the 1937 conference and after the double assassination in France. And the decision among British and also French policymakers is that they needed to avoid World War I happening again. They needed to avoid assassinations sparking a world war. And so the idea was that the League of Nations, as it had been intended, would serve to diffuse the crisis, and that international law could be used as a panacea to address a growing occurrence of assassinations. And so what the policymakers thought is that Yugoslavia would be able to sort of air its grievances, as has been happening for a while with Yugoslavia and Hungary, and that in doing so, if Yugoslavia felt that it could voice, its anger about the assassination of King Alexander, then that in itself would help to prevent war and to make sure that these regional blocs that had come and become more solidified with recent attacks, that they would not things would not escalate and get out of hand, and there would be another world war again. So that was certainly on everyone's mind in 1934. And as I said, it was celebrated as preventing another world war at the time, especially the role played by Anthony Eden. On the second, Japan has signed both the Arms Trafficking Convention of 1919 and 1925. It, of course, has left the League by the time of the 34 through 37 conventions. But I think that also gets to your question a little bit about Kate's question about periodization. And periodization, of course, has been challenged, because when we say, interwar years, we're looking at the British experience, tend to be the British experience of war. But of course, violence and large-scale violence in Asia is much earlier in 1931. Also, and similar to that is Robert Jerworth's work and others showing the continuation of violence after the armistice of 1918. How, as a historian, I think that you do have to with your narrative, you pick your dates, but of course that has its own, historical legacy, its baggages. So in this, I am following a more traditional British periodization here.
Thank you. Kate and Laura, feel free to chime in at any point. And apologies for my puppy that's trying to chime in the background, but I'd like to call on Michael Novak now to ask his question or make his comment.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for being here today. My question is, I was wondering how much, because I know you mentioned early, if I understand you right, you mentioned earlier that you feel that historians of the period tend to focus too much on the rise of fascism. That was still a thing that's going on though. So how much of a relationship do you think there is between the profusion of arms and the general international internet and the rise of international terrorism and the rise of fascism at the same time? Because terrorist acts by paramilitary groups were a huge part of the way fascist parties in Europe operated. So I'm wondering how much of a relationship you see between those and what significance it is.
Thank you for your question. Mary?
Thanks. I'm not quite sure I understand your question. I mean, of course, fascism should be a huge consideration of the period because of the rise of Nazi Germany and the outbreak of the Second World War and of Mussolini to a second degree. But a couple of things I would say this about fascism. For terrorism, it's important because as the legacy, particularly among Western governments, with left-wing groups, it begins to disintegrate because it's mostly right-wing and ultranationalist groups that are carrying out terrorist acts by the 1930s. And so there's a tendency to understand groups of various political or religious backgrounds could use terrorism as a tactic in their campaign. The other issue is an intelligence question, and that is the huge focus of the British and the Americans on the Comintern could be seen as a larger intelligence failure because it was an underestimation of what ended up being the primary threat of the time period, which was the rise of fascism. So that's something that you see in the records, a huge amount of resources that goes into tracking communists and communist literature and foreign fighters, in contrast to fascist and right-wing groups, which are often underestimated, and of course with detrimental consequences for Europe and for the Second World War and for everywhere.
I just wanted to add, I think that the questioner was actually referring to a comment that I made. I had said that many historians tend to, look back at the interwar years with hindsight, knowing what comes next. And I was praising Mary's book for actually putting us in the mindset of great power governments and leaders who saw threats from many directions at the time, right? They didn't know what would happen next. And so they saw many different sort of threats to the status quo and to the system.
I could just pop on really quickly too, and add to this conversation. I think that, one of the things that Mary's book points out is that when you look at the interwar period from the colonies, from places like India, from Palestine, from Algeria, that the distinctions between fascism and liberal democracies are not always as clear as we might imagine now, right? And that in fact, these places that are operating as liberal democracies at home are acting as incredibly brutal military occupiers abroad. And so I think that the distinctions between those types of regimes often look quite blurry, from colonial spaces, from colonized and occupied spaces, in ways that is really kind of worth remembering. And I think, when we think about the legitimacy of projects like the League, I actually, I think going back to this earlier conversation, I'm not sure that the League does not experience delegitimization in 1925. It is illegitimate from the beginning, from its inception, because of what it does vis-a-vis European colonialism and the mandatory system as part of its charter. So I think that that's also a useful corrective that Mary is kind of bringing in here, that there are other perspectives in the rest of the world outside of Europe from which fascism and liberal democracies don't look so different.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Mary, let me perhaps ask a question as we're talking about analytical frames and periodization. Could you talk, I think that's important in a public forum, public historical forum. We also talk about our source space, about the archives. Could you talk a little bit about the materials, the archives you explore, but also to what extent they, shaped your narrative, perhaps some of the limitations as well, but also, if there are one or two archival finds that sort of stick out as particularly relevant or important or exciting, do share as well.
Thank you. I love to talk about the archives, so I appreciate this question. I was lucky and very fortunate to be able to conduct a lot of archival research for this project, and that was of enormous benefit to me and a great experience. So it's based, much of the archival work for this comes from the United Kingdom, of course, the National Archives there, the British Library, and one reason, a couple of things I found when I was starting the project. When I started it after I'd read actually the memoirs of Anthony Eden, when he used the words terrorist to describe the assassin in 1934, it stood out to me that the term was even used at that time. And so in doing this project, I had sort of the end date already set and the end of the story already known. And then it was I actually had to go back and figure out the beginning. And so that took me, again, to start with anarchists and then to really focus on the inter-warriors, which is much less well known. So many great scholars have written about the anarchist period. And from that, I think what stood out is the importance of gun running and gun trafficking, especially for the British, were quite explicit in their language that the danger it would pose for imperial subjects or anti-colonial nationalists to have guns, as well as for anarchists and what are like intellectual misfits, basically, in the cities. And so then I followed the thread really of weapons and the material side of the story, as Laura said, to the archives in France and then to the archives in Geneva, looking at the League of Nations archives. And the other thing is just how much in the archives, but also in the newspapers, that terrorism was used to describe Indian nationalists. And I did not know that story quite as well, but it's extremely prevalent. And part of that is that because the records of the India office are fully open and available at the British Library. And so it is possible to do an in-depth study there. But it is also the term and a focus a lot of in British intelligence at the time, and particularly the nexus with communism. First, some with Islamism, but then later with communism and international communism. And then finally, I was looking at sort of the archives in the U.S. and some of the smaller repositories of papers.
Thank you. I know Eric's got a question, but let me bring perhaps in one or two questions from the Q&A. David Stork's question, would the assassination of a German diplomat in a Paris restaurant in 1938 by a Jewish radical be considered an act of terrorism?
Well, I guess I need a little more context on that question. Consider an act of terrorism by whom?
That's the downside of the Q&A here. See, I don't know. Any response to the question, or
Well, I
don't
guess
wanna-
I'll make that a
what's-
more general question. One of the things that came out with the League of Nations conventions is that there was a lot of intellectual debate prior to the League taking up the matter among European jurists, and a number of conferences and initiatives to define international terrorism, because the fear that terrorism was going to lead to another world war. And so a number of these initiatives included the leading scholars of the time, including Raphael Lemkin, who would go on to write the Genocide Convention later. So, but the decision at the League was that they should define terrorism in a way that wasn't explicit to a certain ideology or a certain political or religious stance, so that the term could be used by governments against any group challenging their rule. And so it was certainly and intentionally designed to preserve state power and to protect the state. This is why it finds favor with authoritarian regimes and with the colonial government in Delhi.
Okay, great, thank you. David, in a further post references to, the Germans, was it an act of terrorism considered by the Germans? So, but there's one more question I want to get to. You mentioned the importance, this is Eric Halali's question, you mentioned the importance of personal relationships in intelligence cooperation. Did you see a shift towards more formalized structures over the course of the 1920s as the security state solidified, or were the personal relationships still quite important at the end of the decade?
One thing I'll say is I looked for cases of whether the Nazis and paramilitary groups in particular were referred to as terrorists. And I could not find, sometimes you find like terrorizing a population, but it's actually the Nazis brought cases to the League, minority petition cases, saying that Czechoslovakia was terrorizing ethnic Germans. So as we're talking about a little bit, the League was often attempted to be used by governments for their own agenda. And I tend also to agree with other scholars that in the big picture aggregate that it was a forwarding of imperial ambitions, particularly British. I think that's first Mark Mazar, or so could be others' position. But that's what I want to say on that. In terms of information and intelligence sharing, it declines at its height during and after World War I, and then it declines by the late 1920s. This special relationship, which I mentioned, Boylston-Beale and Social Branch and MI5, it disintegrates by 1927. And actually, the US and the UK closed a number of their offices that received intelligence information at that time for different reasons. But it's, after the Great Depression, it tends to be a more a shift towards a more nationalist policies. And it's later in the 30s that the British reach out actually first to Hoover and the FBI. And so the State Department plays a secondary role in intelligence sharing. It still plays a role, but not quite as much as it had been during the 1920s in terms of its relationship with the UK.
Thank you. I think David Stork actually is willing to pose this question directly. So David, join us and maybe you can elaborate a little further.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, well, I was under the understanding that the assassination was triggered by a German Jewish man, because of the bad treatment of the Jewish people under the Nazi regime, and that may have partly led to Kristallnacht, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But my question is, was this kind of thing noticed by the League of Nations or the governments as an extra national terrorist activity of any kind? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not as familiar with this case. And also my book, it ends in 1937. So I can't further elaborate on that. But I will say it was very selective which cases made it to the league and which ones did not.
Thank you. Eric, final question.
So let me bring this back to the World War I and the post-World War I period. You know, you have a very compelling section about the United States and the security or the communist threat at the time. And throughout you talk about intelligence cooperation. You say circumstances brought on by the Red Scare demonstrated the continued need for Anglo-American information sharing, ... And so I guess I want to pose the question about intelligence. Having worked with US government records for the World War I and Red Scare period, what I'm struck by is just how little intelligence is in those records and how much kind of prejudice is in those records. Your account of, the botching of, the Palmer raids and the roundup of various Reds. There's not a lot of evidence that they're collecting. This is it's not Keystone Cops, because the brutality that they're engaged in is really, quite severe. But at the end of the day, I am struck by just how little the United States intelligence folks in the Bureau of Investigation or military intelligence actually understand about the threat, that they're engaging. They go after communists when they should be going after Italian anarchists. And so if you could just kind of reflect on the state of intelligence, what is it? And if counterterrorism requires genuinely good intelligence, are they getting it?
And all of that in 2 minutes, Smith.
Yes, well, the Red Scare, I think, certainly highlights the many pitfalls and poor intelligence at the time and excesses of the time in terms of the roundups of anarchists and wobblies and any groups with any type of association with communists. And also, as it's in the Wall Street bombing, of course, like wanting to find a conspiracy behind that attack and wanting to say this was Soviet or American communists, that way that influenced police work and a willingness, detective work. I mean, that is quite discouraging, and the role that prejudice can play is also clear in some of the records and reporting, the way that targets and individuals are described, and certainly those prejudices are clear, both in tending to focus on seeing Russian revolutionaries as Jewish and Jewish posing more of a terrorist threat than others, and sort of the racial factors, seeing African Americans as being possible to be recruited by the Soviets. That all of those prejudices are documented in the records. But in the 1920s, there is a push to professionalize these services, and there are some efficiencies that come out of the First World War. But those issues that we raised, they never go away. And in the end, talking about human intelligence, one reason that the Soviets are so successful in their recruitments is that they play on those prejudices. So with Cambridge 5, for example, the British were not willing to believe that those who came out of the top schools could actually could be recruited by the Soviets. And so then not to the Soviets, but for the Cambridge and the Oxford, and that was intentional. So those prejudices could be used against the intelligence services as well, and also in the case with the U.S.
Thank you. I'm afraid our session will have to end now. We didn't get to a lot of the fascinating, rich details of Mary's book. It is well worth a read. Thank you to Mary, to Kate, to Laura, and of course to Eric for a really wonderful conversation this afternoon. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric for final words. Eric.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, everyone, and those in our audience. We'd like to invite you back to the Washington History Seminar next week when Jeffrey Herf presents on his just published book, Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949, with Carol Fink as our discussant. That's 4 to 5:30 next Monday, April 25th. And with that, we hope to see you next week. Till then, take care, be safe. Good night.